Well, hello to my lovely viewers and friends. Today's book review will be on a little bit of a more sobering topic. So today it'll be Facing Grief by John Flavel. And there you can see, hopefully you can see there, Counsel for Mourners. So facing grief. And that's a very relevant topic, I think, for everyone as they get older. As you get older, the unfortunate truth is that people do pass away, and of course we hate to see it when young people pass away unexpectedly. So a little bit of a personal preface here, I guess, for this book. Well, first, the author is not just writing in theory. So Flavel, his parents, they passed away under tragic circumstances. He also saw the death of a child, 3 of his wives as well, so only his 4th wife survived him. And in this book, he originally wrote it as part of a counsel. He was offering advice to a woman who lost her only child. So he writes to her on how to deal with facing grief. And maybe I can give a little bit of a word of advice, I guess, or because I think if someone read it today, if you were to counsel someone today and you were to take his approach, it would seem almost harsh, because I think in our day and age there is a strong emphasis on feelings, right? We want to be sensitive, we want to offer comfort, but as you read this, you're just reminded of truth. I think Flavel, he really makes that emphasis on you have to remind yourself of the greater truth. Yes, you might be feeling, this amount of sorrow and despair over losing someone that you've loved, but the truth is still greater than your feelings. But today, I think we do have that emphasis on feelings, right? Who are you to say, I can't be sad? Who are you to say, it's not right for me to feel this way? But the truth, it doesn't change throughout circumstances. Our feelings, they do change. So, a little bit of a forward there. I think I agree with everything Flavel says. I just wonder, right, in a one-on-one counsel, how might someone who is grieving take some of this advice? But he does urge all of his readers, his readers specifically, to humbly submit themselves to the rod of God's affliction. So I'll go into a little bit of that. And first, if we look at the chapters, here we can see he begins by explaining the key verse. Actually, even before that, I'll highlight some of his main points. What does he want to accomplish with this writing? And then the key verse, explaining it. Then there's, an appropriate amount of sorrow. Then there's an inappropriate amount. So moderate and immoderate sorrow. And of course, he's not trying to say no sorrow is not allowed at all. So there is sorrow permitted. And then when does sorrow become sinful? I think that's a great chapter. Then there's counsel to ungodly mourners. And then there's godly mourners comforted. I believe he has 20 considerations. So I'm not going to give you all 20, but I'll give you a few points there. Then some objections. What are some objections to some of his advice that he's given? And then a couple of rules. I believe he gives 7 rules to restrain excessive sorrow. So what does he want to accomplish in his book, Facing Grief? Well, first, he wants to say, don't be too hasty to take off that yoke which God has put on your neck. So when these sorrows come, and I think this is true of all our cases with suffering, we desire that our suffering would stop instantly, that our sorrow would stop instantly, sometimes too soon. So it's not that he says that it's wrong to ever pray for sorrow and affliction to go away, but consider, right, what does God have? Why did God allow this to happen? If God is sovereign, then God certainly has a purpose for this. Romans 8:28, all things work together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. So, if God has brought it this way, if God has put you in a season of sorrow, what is God going to do with it? So don't be too hasty to take off the yoke. You can pray for it, but consider what is God doing through it. And then 2, he says, I desire that though you and your afflictions had a sad meeting, yet you and they may have a comfortable parting. So here, he's making reference to Psalm 119. So it's good for me that I have been afflicted. So before I was afflicted, I went astray, but after I've been afflicted, now I know God's commands and his statutes. So hopefully someone who has gone through the sorrow is able to look back on it and at least say, God used it for my good. And then 3, I heartily wish that these searching afflictions may make the most satisfying discoveries, that you may now see more of the evil of sin, the vanity of the creature, and the fullness of Christ. So there, affliction, it shows us oftentimes that we do live for the world, that we are comfortable in sin. But his hope is that, through your afflictions, you might see, sin is actually such a bad thing. I should not be comfortable in it. And then anything created, creatures, whether it's something created, anything in the world, or even a person, there's nothing to be found in them truly. So what should you be looking to? The fullness of Christ only. If you put your full trust in Christ, he alone is your trust, and that's the best position to be as a Christian. And 4thly, I wish that all the love and delight you bestowed upon your little one may now be placed to your greater advantage upon Jesus Christ. So again, the context is that he's comforting a woman who's lost her only child. So here, it's not to put your love and your trust in that child greater than your love for Christ. Hopefully Christ, even though you have loved ones, Christ still remains your greatest love. And then moving on to his 5th and 6th points. So there you might be strengthened with all might in the inner man to all patience, that the peace of God may keep your minds and hearts. So there, being patient under affliction. So again, I think, the worldly person tends to groan and to grumble and to murmur, but the Christian, they are able to be patient under affliction. They're able to say, God is using this for my good. So there he's offering encouragement as well, right? Sit still, be quiet under the rod until it passes over you. And then lastly, his last goal, my heart's desire and prayer to God for you is that you may die daily to all visible enjoyments, and by these frequent converses with death in your family, you may be prepared for your own change and dissolution when it comes. So a strong point, because, he wants you to be less worldly. You're dying daily, you're taking up your cross, you're enjoying the world less and less. And then even when you see death in your family, then you're ready for your own death. You're ready to die one day too. So, quite strong, but I think it's true for every Christian. This world, it's not our home. So, we see death, and we're reminded again that we're living for the age to come, not just for this short, temporary life. So that's an overview of what he hopes to accomplish. The main verse here is Luke 7:13. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. So that's the main verse of at least chapter 1. And then from there, he really draws the principles of what is, correct sorrow. What's a correct amount? And just to give a little context to that verse in Luke 17, there's another widow there, and her only son has died. And then Jesus, he comes along, and he sees her, and he tells her to weep not. And this is, quite the thing to say to a widow, right? Especially in that context of that kind of society, a woman was dependent upon a man for some sort of provision. So she's a widow, she's lost her husband already. So her only hope really is her only son. But the text says, her only son has also died. So there, Jesus says, weep not, even though she has no reason for hope. She's lost all hope. She's among the outcasts of society, the most vulnerable in society. She's helpless. So why can Jesus say, weep not? And Flavel, he makes the point that it's not just because Jesus intends to raise her son, because you consider this advice to everyone else. Jesus, he's not walking around on the earth physically anymore. If we lose a loved one, can we expect them to come back to life? And the answer for us is no. We're not going to expect God to raise them before the last day. So it's not just a special resurrection here. And Flavel makes the point that it's almost like a double what's the word? It's not quite affliction, but if someone were to be raised again, it's almost like, you go through a double suffering, because life on earth is suffering already. And then you die. And it's almost, it's better to die, better to go to God. But then you're brought back and you have to live life again and die again. So that's almost worse. That's one of the points that Flavel makes. But here, if I can sort of say at least, Jesus, he's not forbidding all emotion when he says weep not. Because during times of affliction, if you can say, it doesn't matter that God took away this person, then it's almost like too stoic, right? The Bible never expects Christians to be stoic. If you're stoic, then it's like whatever. Can you even really be afflicted in one sense? But the Bible recognizes that there is affliction, there is suffering, and it's right to have sorrow. So the point there too is that you can complain to God. You can complain directly to God, but you cannot complain about God. So that's an important distinction to make there, that if you're a Christian, if you're facing sorrow, you're allowed to bring your complaints to God. God can bear it. But you cannot complain about God. Like, oh, why did God put me through this? You complain to your friends and you bring dishonor upon God's name. Oh, God has treated me so awfully by taking away the one that I loved. It's not right to complain about God. But you can bring those complaints to God. You can ask, why God? Why are you making me go through this period of suffering and sorrow? And then there are a couple other reasons as well. Here, there's also self-examination. Sometimes God does, actually a lot of the time really, God does chastise us and discipline us for our sins. So during a time of sorrow, it's good to consider, are you the reason why that this trial has come upon you? That's always a sobering thing to think. So it's not that every sorrow is caused by our own sin, but there is good reason to consider, maybe God is disciplining me for a past sin, one that I wasn't repentant of. Is that why I'm going through this period of suffering? So that's the bulk of the first part of the first chapter, just on, when the Lord sees that woman, tells her to weep not, but even then you see glimpses of God's grace and mercy. He knew that her son passed away. He knew that like funeral train was going through that way. So he met the woman there, he stopped the bier, and then he raises that only son back to life. So God, he's not just saying, weep not and does nothing about it, but he does comfort his people. Now, one of the most important things I think he covers is, when does sorrow become sinful? When does sorrow become overwhelming and it's wrong to be this sorrowful over the loss of another person? And one point is when you start to slight and despise all other mercies. So when you look at God's mercies and you think, so what? So what if I have, God's mercy, if I don't have this person? And that leads to an attitude of ignorance, to ingratitude, and really it provokes God. He has such a strong quotes that, it's almost like, because you're so sorrowful over this loss of this one child, you're provoking God to take away your other children or your spouse, take away your husband, your wife, because, that's just how grieved you are. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter anymore that God has kept the rest of my family alive, but, take them too is how sinful really the sorrow becomes. And he has quite the quote, really, another crazy quote on page 26. And if I can point you over to here, rouse up yourself, Christian, and consider this is not right. Surely the rod works not kindly now. What? Did your love to God expire when your friend expired? Is your heart as cold in duty as his body is in the grave? And I really do wonder, right, if you were to tell a mourning person, did your love to God die when your friend died? Is your heart as cold as your friend's body, your beloved's body in the grave? I really don't know, right? I think you need some pastoral wisdom there. But again, yes, the truth, it does not change. So there is at least that point there, that what will take away your love for God? Is it, you have this great love for this beloved family member. If they're taken away, then will you say God is wrong, God is unjust? Is that what will make you curse God's name? And you can think of Job. Job, despite losing everything, he will not curse God's name. He will not say that God has been unjust to him in this area. God is still just. But he does become embittered towards God. I think that's a temptation for us as well. So instead, John Flavel, he encourages Christian mourners to have a gracious heart. And a gracious heart, it's one that justifies God in every situation. So no matter how severe God's strokes are on you, right? That rod, a gracious heart still justifies God's name in every stroke. So no matter what he takes away from you, you're still able to say, God is just, God is good, and God is using this for my good. And a gracious heart stays near to God. So even though you recognize it's painful, you understand that God has brought it this way, your heart still stays near to God. There's no other refuge for you. But an ungracious heart, and here's what he's warning you against, is, it's a secret discontentment. In times of suffering, it is easy to become discontent with God. You lose sight of God, you lose sight of what's good even in the world, and you're prone to cursing God. And it's like Jonah. When God asked Jonah, do you do well to be angry? And Jonah says, yes, I do well to be angry. So his heart is very embittered, but that's his warning. Don't become embittered. Don't have an ungracious heart, but instead have a gracious heart that speaks and thinks well of God and of his works. Another good point was his points here on page 32. So here he's telling mourners, don't renew your sorrow. Don't prick at it and renew it daily. So here it talks about, they rub the wound, they fetch fresh blood from it, they pierce themselves again, they keep like a lock of hair, some trifles, they look at something that used to belong to that person who passed away, and they remind themselves, this person, they died, and they refresh the sorrow. And the story from the Bible is Jacob. When Rachel is dying, she's in labor, she's going through heavy labor, she wants to call her son the son of my sorrow, basically. That's what Benjamin's name would have meant originally there. So the son of my sorrow. But Jacob, he would not allow this. Instead, he calls his son Benjamin, because he does not want to look at his son every time and think, the son of my sorrow, the son where, my wife died. But instead here, Benjamin, son of my right hand, this is my strength. So there, Flavel again is warning against his fixation on grief. Don't try to refresh your sorrows, don't renew your sorrows daily, but instead, you have to make an effort to not pick at that wound, let it heal. And then he moves on to a comfort for godly mourners. So he has like 20 suggestions. I'm not going to give you all of them because there were a lot. But one is recognizing God's sovereignty. So God, he is sovereign. He can do what he pleases, right? And he uses this analogy that if you had a garden, you had a rose in there, and for some reason you just clipped off the bud of a rose. For no apparent reason even. Can anyone say that you were wrong to do so? And the answer is no, because it's your garden. You're able to do as you please. Even though that rose bud didn't bud out yet, and you clipped it away, you can do as you please. That's your garden. And likewise, all things, they truly do belong to God. So family members, they don't belong to me. Everyone belongs to God. The cattle on 1,000 hills, they all belong to God. God can do as he pleases. So there's that. Another reason is, why did Christ die? And he makes the point that it wasn't Christ's purpose to just die so that you can buy, contentment in the world, or, you can find pleasure in the world, or find enjoyment in earthly comforts. But instead, Christ died to redeem you from all your iniquity. Christ died to purge you from your corruptions, to sanctify your nature, to wean your heart away from this vain world. Again, we do not live for this world. So don't let your heart love the things of the world. Instead, your heart should be longing for heaven. You should desire, right? I'm waiting for that heavenly city. I'm waiting for eternal life. I'm not just living for what I can see here. But of course, that is difficult in times of grief. Grief, I think it does make us very short-sighted. We become fixated on, the here and now instead of the grand narrative, the big picture. Another comfort he gives is, if God in his providence takes away someone else, it becomes easier for you to die. And what that means is, if you're going to die right now, you might think, oh, I'm leaving behind, this family. I might have children who are dependent upon me. I have friends who love me. But if God were to take away some of those, right? If God were to take away your family, then... And in one sense, it is easier for you to die. You don't have to worry about your family. You don't have to worry about people who are dependent upon you or people who love you. But if they're taken away, then, you have less attachment to the world. So a little bit of a morbid thought there, I guess, but of some comfort as well. And then here, another consideration is, here the Lord is able to restore all your lost comforts and relations double to you if you meekly submit to him and patiently wait upon him under the rod. So there it's also reminding yourself of God's goodness. God will repay. So he's not just like Jacob, where he only has one blessing for Jacob. Jacob and Esau, he only has one blessing. But instead, God has many blessings. God has more blessings. He certainly has more than one. He's the Father of mercies. So, God, he will certainly repay you. He'll even give you double, right? He repaid Job double for all that affliction and loss that he suffered. So here it's encouragement again to humbly submit yourself to God's rod, patiently wait under him. And one more quote. Here it's saying, Lord, give me Christ, and deny me whatever else you please. Pardon my sin, save my soul, and in order to both, unite me to Christ, and I will never repine or open my mouth. Do what you will with me. Let me be friendless, let me be childless, let me be poor, let me be anything, rather than a Christless, graceless, hopeless soul. So there is that focus, right, again on Christ. Christ alone is your greatest need. So you can suffer the loss of anything, really. You can be childless, you can be friendless. But oh God, do not let me be Christless. Let my soul not be Christless. My greatest need is always Christ alone. I might be friendless, but my best friend is Christ. I might be childless, but I have a Father in heaven. I have a brother, an older brother who is faithful and good. So, though there is pain, right, from these losses, Christ still is greater. That's encouragement there. Some other encouragements: Christ or God will never forget his covenant people. So just like how a nursing mother will not forget her nursing child, so God will not forget you. He's made a covenant with you. He's made many promises to you. Therefore, you can take him at his word. You can trust that he will not forget you. Another advice he gives is not to drown yourself in grief and self-vexation. So that won't ease your burden. It's almost like, there's a bull and his oxen. Instead of just treading along, instead it tries to wrestle its way out of the yoke. And it loses all its strength, right? You can think, if you flail and try to fight against some sort of chain or rope that you can't break, it's not going to do you any good. You're just going to become tired. You're going to lose all your strength. So grief and self-vexation, don't go that route. Instead, again, submit to God. And just a few other brief points. I'll cover them briefly because I think 20 suggestions is just, you have to read it for yourself in order to really see which ones help you the most. But here, God can restore all lost comforts if you patiently wait. And God is also far better than even a spouse. So there you consider the abundant love of God. And he uses two stories here, actually, there's one of a father who loses his child, I believe, and they're another of a wife who loses a gracious husband. But both are still able to have this sense of peace and abundant sense of God's love for them. So God's love, it's still far better than the love that a spouse or a child can offer to you. So again, have your love at its greatest for God first, not just in any creature, any other human being. And other reminders, God uses affliction for the improvement of saints. So times of growth, again, they happen during times of affliction. He also says, consider, the extreme suffering of others. He uses two other stories here as well of intense persecutions. Here, I do wonder too, right? If you tell someone, you haven't suffered as much as that person, in this third world country or in this persecuted country, so therefore you should be glad. So in part, it is technically true, right? You should be glad you don't have to undergo as intense kinds of sufferings. But at the moment, right, all suffering feels painful. How does that relieve you of your suffering? But that is one that he does bring up more than once. And then God alone is the fountain of all comfort. He's the only true comfort that is there for your soul. So again, remind yourself of that. God, he's the Father of mercies. He can give you mercy. And he also quotes Seneca, so seek one whom you may love in his stead. It is better to repair than to bemoan your sin, your loss. So instead of, just mourning the loss of this person, seek the one who's you're able to love instead. And again, God, he'll never die. So here his quote is, love God first and foremost. So I've sort of just covered very briefly, right, his considerations or his advice to both ungodly mourners and also to godly mourners. It's the main bulk of his book there. Then he sort of goes through a couple objections that might come up. And these are fair questions to ask. So pleas for immoderate grief answered. Some of them are what about a lovely, obliging, and most endearing child, one that's beautiful and sweet? So what can I do, right? I've lost this sweet child, what can I do? Or even, I believe there's another one that's, this loved one of mine, I don't know if they know Christ. What now? And he has a lot of pleas and objections, but he answers them all. So I do advise seeing how he has answered them. And again, he does bring biblical wisdom, so he does answer them all well. I do feel like they are sort of similar trains of thought, this person, I wanted them to be around, I love them so much, why should I not be overwhelmed with grief? So really, again, his plea, Flavel is just saying, be moderate in your grief. Remind yourself of the truth. Don't let your grief consume you. And then his last chapter is rules to restrain excessive sorrow. So he has 7 rules. And one, it's not setting your delights and love excessively on creature comforts. So again, it's putting your love and trust in the right spot. If you put it in the wrong thing, then that's what can hurt you the most. But if you put your love and trust in God first and foremost, then God can never hurt you in one sense. God might, send some afflictions your way, but it is for your good ultimately. But if you put your love and trust in, a child or in a parent or a spouse, and you lose them one day, or they betray you even, then there's great opportunity for hurt and for sorrow, for grief. Second point, so exercising your duties properly toward them while you have them. So here, I think this was a really good point actually, because, and I'll sort of mention this a little bit more, I think, in my personal thoughts, but though I don't have a family myself, I have parents, I have a sibling, but though I don't have a family where I'm the husband or father, if I were to have one, I think I have to consider them as a steward. I'm simply a steward of this wife that God has given me. I'm a steward of the children that God has given to me. They don't truly belong to me. So I must exercise my duty towards them properly. So there I must lead them in family worship. I must lead them in the ways of the Lord. I must trust them as souls who have been entrusted to me. And in that sense, it's also true of friends as well, right? So behaving properly towards a friend who doesn't know Christ, then, I ought to make Christ known to them. I ought to make sure that when they see me, they can see that I'm living for the gospel, for Christ. His third rule, cast your sorrows and burdens upon God. So there again, who can relieve you of your burden? Only God. God is the one who wounds and heals. So go to God. Though you're heavy, your sorrows and burdens are heavy, God, he can bear them. God, he will hear you out. He stores up your tears in the bottle. He knows. So bring them to him. 4, keep your eyes fixed on God, not on circumstances. This is also another good point. I think, again, yes, sorrow and despair and grief. We become so short-sighted. We're so fixated on the loss of that loved one. We're fixated on our own grief. And we forget God. So there he encourages, look to God. God, again, he's our hope. If we look at our circumstances and our grief, there's no hope to be found there. But hope is found in God. 5, again, he does say, compare with other people's afflictions. So, a tough pill to swallow, but you consider, if you lose one child, well, consider Aaron. Aaron lost both his children at once. He wasn't even allowed to weep or to grieve. And then consider Job. He lost all his children all at once. They all died in one stroke. So consider what other people have suffered as well. 6, his 6th rule, do not renew sorrow or impatience. So again, that concept of, you don't prick away at that wound. You don't, as Rachel did, try to name her son of my sorrow. But instead, Jacob, he says, Benjamin. This will be Benjamin. And here he's trying to make the point that, you don't give occasion to murmuring or to blaspheming thoughts. If you do sort of give yourself to that temptation, you're setting yourself up for failure. So instead, whenever any murmuring or blasphemous thoughts come in, you must take captive of them. You must cast them away. Give no opportunity for any murmurous or blaspheming thoughts to come up. Don't let your heart become embittered towards God. So you must think well of God, seek to justify him again. That's what a gracious heart does. And then 7, a little bit morbid, but consider your own death and its nearness. So death reminds us that we are all here only temporarily. Those of you who are young, we don't truly know how much time we have. So we could be here today, we could be gone tomorrow. So again, consider, when you see the death of others, consider your own death, and then consider how near your death is also. So those are the main points. Again, I think, this book it's a good read, because we will all encounter death and grief. And it's good to be prepared to know how to grieve well. And Flavel, he does a pretty good... He is comprehensive, so it's 122 pages. It's relatively short. He offers a lot of counsel. So it's a great book for someone who is going through grief. And here, specifically, it is grief for a child, for a spouse, the death of someone really specifically. For myself, I was reading it just during a time of sorrow and grief. I think I still found it applicable. It's important that no one is overwhelmed by grief. There's just opportunities for unbelief, for sin, for bitterness against God, but it is a good reminder that, your grief, it's right to feel sorrow over a loss, but it must not be overwhelming. It must not, take away your love from God. Instead, this affliction, it should drive you to God. You can wrestle with God. You can bring your complaints to God. Don't complain about God. Complain to God and see, what is God using this sorrow for? How is he using this for my good? I think that's a hard question, right? So I don't personally know the loss of a child or a parent or a sibling, but if God were to take away one of them, how might God be using that for my good? I think that really is a great challenge. So Though Flavel sort of speaks matter-of-factly, it is a book, right? It's hard to tell his tone. I would like to imagine that he does have a very soft pastoral tone towards those he's counseling. I don't think he is heartless at all. Some of his advice, if you read it, it sounds a little bit cold, but he is very warm throughout the rest of the book. So, though he is making this emphasis on truth, I think we ought to assume the best. Don't have to assume that he's just being cold and trying to beat you with this truth, like, just don't be sad. But he is saying, grieve correctly, in one sense. Grieve moderately. As Christians, we're commanded to not grieve as those who have no hope. But we do have a great hope. Death, it's not the end. It is a terrible thing. That's a consequence of a fallen world. But it truly is not the end for a Christian. So, grief, it is a heavy topic, but one that Christians should be well prepared for. We don't just live mindlessly thinking that we all get a full life, but sometimes God might take away those under our care sooner than we expect. Again, that idea of stewardship. I'm a steward of my time, my money, and also of my relationships. If I have children, if I have a wife, they don't truly belong to me. I'm just a temporary steward, so long as I have them in this life. But then it matters how I spend my time with them. Yes, I should show love to them, but I also have to be proper in my duty towards them. If I'm a father, a husband, how am I a spiritual leader to them? Have I done them spiritual good, first and foremost? In one sense, I think that's maybe one of the worst things that happen, right? If you were to suffer the loss of a child and then you just look back and think, I haven't been a spiritual steward. I haven't given them anything of spiritual benefits, and then they died in their sin. I think that would be just such a awful regret to have. But, if you were to bring them the word faithfully each day, you do family worship, if you've done all that you could to try to bring them to Christ, and then God takes them away, and you recognize, it's the Lord's will. Let God do what seems good to him. The Lord gives and he takes away. Let's bless God. And there, I think, there is just that important part, just stewardship again. My hope, my love, my trust, that alone is in God, not in any creature. If it is in a creature, I will suffer great grief. But if my hope and trust and love is in God alone, then through affliction, I can still praise his name. I can sanctify his name. I can say he is still just. So those are my thoughts. I hope it's come across, fairly and warmly. I do understand, in this day and age, we do have a tendency to be more sensitive and gentle, but hopefully not at the cost of truth. The truth, again, it always stays the same, but our feelings, they're always so fickle and so dependent on circumstances. And actually, if I can sort of recommend other books that deal with suffering as well. So here, I've already talked about crook in the lots, right? So that thorn in your side, when you go through times of affliction, how might God be using that to further sanctify you? Similar vein of thoughts. All Things for Good by Thomas Watson. So here, Romans 8:28. How does God work all things for good? I'll probably do a book review on this in the near future. But Romans 8:28. How does God even use evil for our good? And here is maybe more of a gateway book, Spiritual Depression. This was one of the books that probably got me into the Puritans. These are a series of sermons by Martin Lloyd-Jones on spiritual depression. As Christians, we ought to be the most joyful people in the world, and that is lacking. But here, what hope does a Christian have in the Bible and in God? So these are also great books to consider. Spiritual Depression, I think, especially is a good starter one. A little bit lengthy, a little bit dry too, because it is his sermons. But this one has actually done me much good, so I do hope to review this one in the future as well. So hope this will be useful to you, and hope to see you in the next video. Grace to you and peace.